Welcome to the Zest podcast, the podcast that flips the script on traditional coaching. Here, we challenge the status quo by turning coaching relationships on their heads. Instead of the usual dynamic where coaches lead the way, we give the coachee the mic. Each episode, a coachee interviews their coach, diving into topics they're both passionate about, be it leadership, personal growth, or navigating challenges such as neurodiversity in the workplace. Our unique format inspires authentic conversations, shared learning, and fresh perspectives. We are showcasing the dynamic chemistry that comes from real-world coaching relationships. The mission is to disrupt power dynamics, spark curiosity, and offer you inspiring, zesty insights into work, life, and everything in between. So join us as we explore bold ideas, unfiltered stories, and the transformative power of coaching, zesty style.
Hi everyone, and welcome to today's episode. I'm Mariam. I'm a freelance consultant and editor and producer of this podcast. Today's episode is incredibly special to me. I'm joined by the incredible Dr. Belinda Zakrzewska. Hi, Belinda.
Hi.
So let me tell you a little bit about Belinda. She is an assistant professor of marketing at Birmingham Business School, a fellow of Higher Education Academy, and the founder of the Interdisciplinary Authenticity Group, a group of early career and mid-career researchers that have been meeting almost every month since 2021 to discuss research projects about authenticity in fields like management, organization studies, marketing, psychology, and sociology. Her research explores the intersections of cultural production and colonialism, looking at how authenticity is constructed and how those constructions can reproduce systems of power, especially in post-colonial contexts. Her doctoral dissertation, Anti-Manual for the Organizational Construction of Authenticity in Post-Colonial Contexts, was awarded the Best Critical Dissertation Award by the Academy of Management's Critical Management Studies Division in 2023. Belinda was my dissertation supervisor for my master's at university back when she was working at the University of Sussex, and working with her was honestly a breath of fresh air. Beyond our supervision meetings, we had rich conversations about social justice, cultural appropriation, colonialism, and how these issues manifest in spaces we inhabit. I always remember leaving our chats both challenged and energized, and Belinda's guidance and support continue to be a huge part of my academic journey. So today I'm really excited to explore her research and ideas together in this space. Belinda, it's such a privilege to have you here.
No, thank you, Mariam. The pleasure is mine.
So should we get straight into it?
Sure.
So your research often engages with how authenticity is constructed. Could you start by sharing what authenticity means in your work?
Well, that's a very good question. So, let's say that the general consensus is that authenticity refers to something that is true, that is original, that it's the kind of the real thing, if you will. And the beautiful thing about doing research on authenticity is that you can look at it from different lenses, but in my research specifically, I look at marketplace authenticity. So what makes brands, products, consumer experiences authentic? And in a recent paper by Lehman and colleagues, I really like this paper because they classify like 3 definitions of authenticity. So one is like connection. So if you think about, for instance, what makes a wine authentic, usually it's terroir, right? Which is the French word for, if you will, like territory, but that's not the exact translation. It has to do with the climate. It has to do with the traditions of the place. It has to do with the soil. So it encompasses a lot of things. And it's that connection that the final product, this wine, will have with terroir. It can also be, for instance, if you're a fan, I don't know, are you a fan of a band, Mariam?
Am I a fan of a band? Yeah.
Okay, which band? Give me a band.
Sleep Token.
Okay, I don't know that then. But for instance, imagine that you go to a record store, right, and you see a record that has been signed by them. So that makes it authentic, right?
Yeah.
Because it has this connection to a place, a person, right? And so that gives it
Yeah.
authenticity. But that's just one of the definitions. Another definition is like when a product, for instance, conforms to the traditions, to the norms of its category. So, for instance, if you're, I don't know, you are performing or singing or I don't know, just performing, I guess, blues music. Like it has to follow like specific patterns, specific like rhythms, which
Yeah.
will make it different from, let's say, reggaeton. And then you also have consistency, which is interesting as well because it's about how the brand, the organization, the product aligns its core values with their actions. So are they being consistent between what they say they do and what they actually do?
Yeah.
So this is, for instance, something that I think I don't know if we talked about it, but it was all over, social media and the newspapers about Ben and Jerry's, right?
Yeah.
How the CEOs wanted to keep those values and commitments to social justice and how now it's a bit more complicated because of the whole situation with Unilever. So in that case, you can see that the CEOs of or former CEOs of the brand were being authentic because they were being
Yeah.
consistent between what they said the brand stands for and what they were trying to do. So as you can see, authenticity it has different meanings, right?
Yeah.
And also will depend on who you ask, right? Depends on the context, depends on the experience that the consumer has. So yeah, I mean that's the beauty of authenticity.
Yeah. Thank you for showing that. Really, yeah. Interesting how one word or like one thing can be so dynamic and mean so many different things in so many different contexts. But I want to talk about cultural appropriation a little bit. The term cultural appropriation gets used a lot and sometimes a little bit loosely. So how do you understand cultural appropriation in relation to authenticity?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and that's something that I explored in my recently published paper. Well, not recently anymore because it's 2026, so but it was last year. Um, so yeah, well, to begin with, cultural appropriation. How do I understand it? So in that paper, we define cultural appropriation as the non-consensual or inappropriate adoption of elements by a dominant group, right, that takes, let's say, those cultural elements from a subordinate group. And this is, I would say, more noticeable when there are historical power asymmetries. So for instance, between white people and Native Americans, right? You have the example of the dream catchers, for instance. I don't know if you've
Oh
seen
yeah,
them.
yeah.
And they are like, for instance, mass produced, right? Or also the case of like the Native American headdresses, which have a lot of like deep cultural symbolic meaning to these communities. But then you have white Americans. Well, let me make a kind of like a note here. I should be saying like white people from the US because
Sure.
Americans, it refers to the whole continent.
Yeah.
So you have, let's say, like white consumers going to festivals, wearing them as it's just like part of a costume. So it could be disrespectful. So it is more like I said, it's this kind of adoption of these cultural elements from a subordinate group by a dominant group, and again more noticeable when you have these historical power asymmetries. But so yeah, and how does that, let's say, relate to authenticity? So that's actually like a very good question. So in the paper, we say that marketers, right, producers will use authenticity claims to make that connection, like I was telling you with this example of a band, for instance, or the wine, to make a connection to a specific marginalized group. And what the theory shows, and any example you read online, is that most white Western people are kind of drawn to these cultures that are seen as exotic. So
Yeah.
they are drawn to new food, for instance, that is labeled as exotic, or maybe like designs, like fashion, like clothes that have like patterns, different patterns that you haven't seen before. So there's this connection. So I'll just give you another example, maybe that would help things a little bit better. So for instance, I read this really cool book. The name was Crafting the Culture and History of French Chocolate. And they talked about, well, in this book, the author, Susan Theriault, she talks about how during colonial times, French chocolatiers from France would create these beautiful, chocolates, very delicious, and they would use the image of Black African producers of cocoa in their advertising. But the problem is that they would not portray these producers in, let's say, a positive light necessarily.
Yeah.
They were depicted in like a cartoonish kind of way, or they would be portrayed as looking naive, maybe a bit, silly. So that would kind of project authenticity in the sense that it resonated with the image that French people had at that time, and it would also make the chocolate more authentic because you knew that the cocoa was coming from Africa, right? So authenticity is related, let's say, in that sense, to cultural appropriation, because you do want to portray authenticity, but in a way, you also can ask yourself, like, how authentic is that if you're not portraying like the real thing? And that's why, at the beginning of this conversation, I was telling you, like, it depends who you ask. It depends on like the experience that the consumer has, the pre-established kind of notions that the consumer also has. I think, like, just now came to mind that I was talking with someone that went to Mexico, and I think that they were like, I think they went to, like, not the northern part of Mexico when you have like Tex-Mex, but to another part of Mexico, and I was talking to him, and I was telling him, like, burritos are not like kind of like authentic traditional Mexican food, and he was like, no. And I was like, no, like that was, like, kind of created and adopted. I'm not sure. I would have to check because I'm not an expert on Mexican cuisine, but I believe it's part of the Tex-Mex, which is like in the border with with the US. So that's a very specific kind of cuisine. But then Western people think that, the typical burritos, tacos, like that's the stereotypical image of Mexico, or like having piñatas, for instance. So a Mexican restaurant cannot be authentic if you don't have like a piñata or sombreros, like all this stuff, which, is not true. But those are like the elements that marketers, producers can leverage to project authenticity. And most often than not, especially here in the UK, you have Mexican restaurants that are owned by British people, So yeah, that's interesting as well.
So on the note of cultural appropriation, something I thought would be I think is quite an interesting discussion is, where do you see the line between cultural appreciation and cultural appropriation, and who gets to decide where that line is? I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that.
That's a interesting question, and one that is maybe my answer will be a bit controversial, because I feel like most people tend to associate cultural appropriation with negative outcomes, and cultural appreciation with positive outcomes.
Yeah.
And they tend to see this as a dichotomy, right? Like you cannot have cultural appropriation with appreciation. But in fact, in my research, what I found is that both can coexist.
Yeah.
So let me give you perhaps a little bit of background on my research, like what my research is about, so that I can better illustrate those with examples. So my research was about the new Peruvian cuisine. And this is kind of, yeah, it's a new cuisine that kind of emerged in the early 2000s, and it has been spearheaded by celebrity chefs. And these chefs, most of them have quite a bit of prestige in the sense that they they studied abroad and they came back with knowledge from the French haute cuisine and could use those techniques to elevate some elements, ingredients, techniques of Peruvian cuisine. It's maybe perhaps it's also important to mention that at that time, in like the early 2000s, in Peru, Peruvians wanted to go to like French, Italian restaurants. They didn't want to necessarily go to a Peruvian restaurant. So there was a lot of like marginalization to our native ingredients, right? So what these celebrity chefs started doing was, as I said, elevating those ingredients, techniques, traditions with fine dining techniques, and that's how the new Peruvian cuisine kind of emerged. And it's still, in the making. But most people have seen the positives of this cuisine, which is like, for instance, more tourists coming to the country, which in turn means, more money for the tourist sector. There's also like this sense of pride that now Peruvians have, which is like very important because just so people know, I'm also Peruvian. I'm Polish Peruvian. I was born and raised in Peru, and the thing is that we were divided socially. We were Peruvian society was socially fragmented. Let's put it this way, for many reasons, starting with colonialism that created like these hierarchies between indigenous people and people from the capital, who were most of them descendants of the Spaniards that colonized us. Then you had like internal terrorism. You had like an economic crisis. Everything like it was a combination of things.
Yeah.
And so when these celebrity chefs started putting Peruvian cuisine in the world map, it created a sense of pride that all of us had a reason to celebrate and to be proud of who we are. And so this kind of narrative, this if you will, putting on these positive lenses, kind of started shifting a little bit in the last couple of years, thanks to the work of some scholars like Maria Elena Garcia and Raúl Mata, that started doing research on Peruvian cuisine and kind of like the dark side, if you will, like what is going on that we cannot see. And some of the things that they, discovered was that, and that it also resonates with my research, is that there's a lot that we don't necessarily see or think about Peruvian cuisine. For instance, the fact that the prices are so elevated. So if I wanted to go to this, to a celebrity chef's restaurant, I would have to spend 2,000 pounds or dollars in just a tasting menu. And I believe that that's kind of more or less the minimum wage for someone in Peru. So if you think about it, not like not anyone, right, can go to this restaurant. And so that creates this, which is also very ironic because the people whose traditions, ingredients are being displayed and elevated cannot go and be
Go.
consumers of that.
Yeah.
So that's one of, the dynamics, if you will. Another dynamic is like they are reevaluating, giving new value to ingredients that even us Peruvians didn't know we had, or those outside those indigenous communities didn't know we had. And that's great because that means that those indigenous communities can now profit from those ingredients. They can sell them, right? And they have some economic revenue. The problem is that, similar to the case of the French chocolatiers, sometimes the chefs, from what I've been told in my interview, sometimes the chefs will ask these producers to dress up in their typical costumes, for the picture. And they don't necessarily wear those clothes on a daily basis. So it's just for the picture, right? Or chefs claim to have like a very strong connection to producers. Sure, but it's mainly transactional. And indigenous communities have a different cosmovision that I don't think you and I can fully understand, but it's more relational, right? It's not transactional. So they wish that chefs would go and stay with them for a couple of days or a week. And some chefs do it, which is the great thing. But some chefs don't. And they just go and take the picture and post it on their website. So that shows you, right, that there are some practices that are linked to cultural appropriation. But at the same time, those practices, or not necessarily those practices, but like there's a positive side, which is the one that we tend to see more, right? Which is like revaluating products, creating this new cuisine that is giving Peruvians so much, such a reason to be proud. And so it's complicated. So to answer your question, I don't think that in some cases you have a clear line between cultural appropriation and appreciation. I believe that in most cases, when a dominant group is taking the elements of a subordinate group, there will be some sort of positive to it, right? It could even be the fact that you're saying that, imagine, in the case of mass producing these dream catchers, right? Maybe you will write like something like, from this indigenous community, right? Like taken from this indigenous community or something, or taking inspiration from this indigenous community. And it's already kind of giving visibility to them. The problem is that this indigenous community is not receiving any compensation for that. And it has not been consulted if it's okay for it to be mass produced or for it to be shared with people outside the community. So in a way, there might be pros and cons in that sense. So who gets to decide where the line is? Again, I think just it's very subjective, right? The problem with cultural appropriation and appreciation, and I was talking about it with someone that I was also interviewing for another project, was telling me that there is no kind of like intellectual property for something, right? So sometimes it's hard. It would be easier if there were like legal, like, I don't know, rules or norms that could help people and guide them. But yeah.
No, I would agree with a lot of what you said, to be honest. But moving on from a bit, and since you brought in your research, could you tell us a little bit more about what drew you to the context of your research, please?
That's a that's a little bit of a long story, but long story short, when I was applying for a PhD, I needed to write my proposal, right? Like what I think I could do my research on. And initially, well, first of all, I knew I wanted to do it in the UK. So I was like, well, if I'm gonna study in the UK, then maybe I could focus on like the Latin American community, maybe in London. And I found out that there was this kind of Latin American district called Elephant and Castle in London. I don't know if you're familiar with it.
Oh, very familiar. Love
Okay, cool. So,
it.
so I remember, okay, in 2019 when I arrived to the UK, there was this shopping mall in Elephant and Castle, and it had like hairdressers, restaurants. It had so many different stores and businesses, and I was like, great. I mean, maybe I can look at look at this case, look at how Latin American entrepreneurs are adapting their offer to satisfy, the needs and expectations of people in the UK, something along those lines. I just didn't exactly like that let's say that was just the general idea. And as I was talking to more people and developing the research idea more, and I was also reading more, uh, I thought it would be interesting to focus on restaurants because they had I, my this is silly, okay? But I just thought like it's more interesting because they have like this supply chain, and then there are things happening inside the restaurant, and then you have the consumers. Like it just seemed to have like to provide more data, if you will.
Mm,
And again, I was not like necessarily thinking as a researcher back then. I was just like kind of going with a gut feeling.
mm.
Uh, and then um, someone asked me like, why don't you focus on Peruvian cuisine since you're Peruvian? And I was like, I never thought of that. Okay, I could do, but the problem is I don't know how many Peruvian restaurants we have in London. I don't think we have enough Peruvian restaurants for me to focus on, that. So I was doing my research and I was surprised because we had like back then at least like 10 famous Peruvian restaurants,
Yeah.
and like maybe 30 restaurants that claim to do Latin American food or just any type of Latin American cuisine, but they would include like a dish or two, that were Peruvian. So that was interesting, and I was like, okay, let's do that. Peruvian restaurants in London. What happened next is the pandemic, the
Oh,
COVID-19 pandemic.
oops.
Yeah. So I couldn't, conduct my research. I was planning on going to London, talk with people in person, but then we were all like it was just, a bit of chaotic, I would say. And we were all in quarantine. We couldn't go out. And so plan B was to read about Peruvian cuisine, right? What do we know about Peruvian cuisine? And that's when I started reading the work of Maria Elena Garcia and Raúl Mata, whom I mentioned earlier. And I really liked what they were writing because it was more of a critical analysis of the new Peruvian cuisine. Something that never crossed my mind, but I was very aware of like these power dynamics in Peru because of like what I was telling you, like
Yeah.
mainly colonialism. And I was like, this is very interesting. And I wish we could dive deeper into this. So I thought maybe because we're all, locked in our houses and we cannot go out, maybe I can interview people in Peru rather than in London.
Mm.
And maybe I could even interview some of these chefs because they are not working, they're not going to the restaurants, they are at home. And so that's what happened, and I started talking to them. Uh, and and then I could see, that there were positives and negatives to it. And that's how, this paper on cultural appropriation and appreciation kind of arose from
Yeah.
that data. Yeah.
So COVID was a blessing for you, a blessing in disguise for
Yes.
you.
Yes. I mean, as hard as it was, and
Yeah.
and how horrible it was for so many people who
Yeah,
lost,
100%.
family members, friends. Um, I think that I'm thinking most of the PhD students in my cohort, I think, benefited from it because they could work on their research. And I believe, and don't get me wrong, it was really hard anyways, because we for at least for me, because I didn't have any family in the UK, right? And I couldn't travel, and so it was very hard, like
Yeah.
psychologically speaking, emotionally speaking, very, very, very hard. But I was lucky enough to have that time and spend it doing my research as well. So yeah.
And I think there's going a bit off topic here, but there's been many ways in which COVID has kind of benefited us in terms of like, even us just being able to. I don't think this platform existed before to be able to record a podcast like this online. But anyways, don't want to get too off topic.
That's right.
So, what did you observe about how Peruvian chefs navigate the tension between innovation and tradition? And how might that mirror the broader dynamics of cultural appropriation? I know we kind of briefly talked about this.
Yeah. So yeah, that's also a very good question. So this tension between innovation and tradition, I think it mainly comes, like what we say in the paper is that it mainly comes from the market in which these chefs are in, right? It's a fine dining culinary space.
Yeah.
So there is this demand for innovation. And if you want to use Peruvian ingredients, especially if you want to use Peruvian ingredients and even more like these marginalized Peruvian ingredients, it needs to be presented in a more refined, elevated, modern way. So when we were writing this paper, the reviewers asked us these questions, and I remember saying, like, it's not like these elite chefs are in their houses, sitting in a comfy sofa thinking, how do we engage in cultural appropriation? Like they don't have that intention. I at least don't believe they have that intention. It's more about like, right, how do we make a dish that is Peruvian with Peruvian ingredients, but it's in a way it appeals to, especially to tourists, because these are the ones, this is the main target audience for these restaurants, right? The tourists are the ones who can afford a $200 menu. So I'll give you the example of the guinea pig, which I frequently use. So if you go to the Andes, right, you will be served the guinea pig whole. So that means you will be served the guinea pig will be fried with the forelegs and the head, and it will be served to you like that on a plate, right? And that can, you see, like you just had a reaction. So like that will put some people off, right? And especially like Western people, because they are like, no, but guinea pigs are pets. They always tell me that, like, how can you eat guinea pigs? Like, they are pets. But it's completely different for Andean communities, because not to go too off topic, like during the Inca Empire, guinea pig was perceived as a sacred animal that was used for like celebrations, special occasions. So it had a lot of importance, cultural, symbolic importance. So they still eat guinea pig in the Andes, and but the thing is that these celebrity chefs cannot serve you a guinea pig whole, right? That is not fine dining. So they need to find like creative ways of still serving you that, and still kind of creating that authenticity, right? By connecting you with the Andes.
Yeah.
So what they do is, for instance, they will cook the guinea pig, and they will take the meat and they will put it inside like a taco or a ravioli. So it's more refined, more elevated, more modern, but still using this kind of exotic ingredients that
Mm.
Western tourists are like interested in. So yeah, so that's what I would say in
Yeah.
terms of that. But um, I don't know. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, I think it does. I suppose they are sort of almost kind of finding a balance between innovation and tradition in a way.
Yeah, they are. I mean, here's the thing. Like I was telling you, the new Peruvian cuisine is still in the making, and there are
Mm.
no clear boundaries as to what counts as the new Peruvian cuisine and what doesn't. So when I was interviewing some of my participants, they were telling me about, and I also talked to some of the chefs. So some of them have a very different way of cooking.
Mm.
So you have like almost two groups. One group that will create these very like I don't know, innovative dishes like the guinea pig, and then you have another one that will cook more traditionally. So you
Mm.
can really tell like, oh, this dish, like my mom cooked it, or this dish, I never tried it but my grandma told me about this dish, you know, and it's cooked in a modern way.
Yeah.
So it's difficult to kind of perhaps say in general how these chefs are going about tradition and innovation. Like I said, there are like these two main groups, and I think that the group that is creating these very innovative dishes can fall more into like cultural appropriation because they take ingredients, elements, traditions that have a lot of important cultural meaning to indigenous groups, and
Mm.
they just kind of like decontextualize them, right? And then recontextualize them in this fine dining setting, and the meaning, the yeah, all the cultural meaning is lost, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, but again, is just a way of like looking at specific cases. Something that might be interesting to also mention is that
Mm.
outside the restaurants, these celebrity chefs are also doing things. So,
Mm.
one chef, for instance, is trying to help, or not trying, but has helped an Amazonian indigenous community by revaluating their it's like a sauce from the cassava or manioc.
Mm.
So it's like a yeah, it's a sauce, and this community now is profiting from it, right? So the chef has allowed them to enter the market, like has yeah, in a way facilitated for this indigenous group to go into the market.
Mm.
And now they are profiting from their tradition, which is great. So you can also see there, like, you know, tradition, like how they balance tradition and innovation outside the restaurant. So they are also doing that.
It's very interesting to hear about how they're doing it outside of their work and restaurant as well. I'm just gonna move on to some of the final questions just for the sake of time. Um, but yeah, one I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts on is what conversations do you wish were happening more often in academia or just even in everyday life around decolonization and cultural appropriation?
Well, when it comes to decolonization, I think that we cannot talk about decolonization without indigenous peoples.
Mm.
And I think that they are forgotten or overlooked or just taken for granted. And I say that based on like some of the papers that I've read, some of the conferences that I have attended. So there are ways, you know, if someone wants to truly decolonize something, um, there are ways. So, for instance, I can give you this example that uh, last semester I was teaching a module, and it was about global marketing and, you know, responsibility issues. And all of the things that I was teaching were very Western centric. Even though, you know, I was telling my students, like, cultural appropriation happens. We should be aware of this, because once you go onto once you go and work for a company, like, you should be aware of, like, cultural appropriation. This can happen. But again, it's just more of a critique, perhaps, of things that they could do. So for the last session, I told my students, listen, most of the things we've learned, and most in this module, and most of the things you've learned throughout your program, are Western centric. So I invited 3 indigenous guest speakers to my class. 2 of them are indigenous entrepreneurs. They are the founders of a company that provides tea, coffee, and chocolate. And I also invited a indigenous scholar who's a very good friend of mine. And all of them, created an amazing presentation for my students, and they provided a very nice overview of what the situation in Canada, and they call it Turtle Island to refer to North America. They provide an overview of what is going on in Turtle Island in relation to colonialism and indigenous peoples. And then the indigenous entrepreneurs talked about how they have entered the market, this capitalist colonial market, but bringing their indigenous traditions and their indigenous cosmovision as well. So it was amazing. So I feel like we need more of that, right? If we're going to talk about decolonization, we should also, if we're writing about decolonization, then we should also perhaps think about having an indigenous co-author, right? Especially if you are not indigenous yourself. So all of these things, I think, are important and should be highlighted.
Yeah, I think the term about like decolonizing something has become a bit of a buzzword,
I agree.
and has become like I often invite the people that I'm working with to like define what that means to them when they throw it around. And so like in some of the work that I've done with performing arts curriculum, it's been about like, something like incorporating, for example, they usually, when you go in and look at their curriculum, they usually only talk about Elizabethan theatre and Roman theatre, and they don't talk about any other theatre traditions from around the world, in which like, various theatre practices have evolved from. And so like something that I will do is recommend that they will incorporate, different non-Western perspectives. But I think, yeah, I agree with a lot of what you're saying about decolonization. What about in terms of cultural appropriation?
Um, well, at least in my module, for instance, we talk about cultural appropriation. So that's a good thing that I'm allowed to talk about it. I'm not really sure about what other scholars
Yeah,
are doing, but I know that at least in marketing, the topic is uh, kind of emerging. So it's a good
definitely.
thing. It's a good thing. Yeah, more papers are being published on cultural appropriation in marketing, which is a good thing because um yeah, we kind of take, I don't know, I don't really know what it is, but it's just um yeah, it's gaining attention, so it's a good thing.
I think it's like, I don't know, maybe people are finding it easier to have conversations about these things, or they don't, it doesn't seem as intimidating to have conversations, like it just engaging in a dialogue where um you know people don't feel necessarily attacked for being, as an example, called out for doing something that is appropriative. I'm not sure what it is either, but or
I,
yeah.
I don't know either. I mean, I think that, and I could be completely wrong here, but perhaps. marketing has been so focused, I mean, as a field, right, has been
Yeah.
so focused on just delivering, right, like an experience, a product, like very customer focused, very strategic in that sense. Um, that maybe it has overlooked a bit of more like critical aspects of marketing. And I think that some researchers are now paying attention to those critical questions and topics, because discussions of cultural appropriation, they've always been there.
Yeah.
If you go to like Reddit, or you just Google, cultural appropriation, like a colleague of mine wrote cultural appropriation in the New York Times, and she had like thousands of results. So people have been having these conversations. It's just a matter of like uh, bringing those conversations into like the academic uh, field, if you will,
Mm.
into the classrooms. Yeah, because that's my feeling from teaching marketing. I feel like we're very oriented toward strategy, right?
Yeah.
How, like, to teach our students to deliver, right? Once they go out and go to I don't know, have a job, like how can they deliver? But we kind of dismiss these more critical questions that and things that are happening. So we should not ignore those. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. And I remember sitting in where I spoke about my research in one of your modules. I remember sitting in and listening to you talk in that module and being like, I wish I had more of this. um, but yeah, so last question for you. Has anything surprised you about how people have responded to your research? Maybe something that's challenged or deepened your own understanding?
Uh, that's a good question. I think that nothing has nothing comes as such off the top of my head, but I think that I am still surprised about the reluctance of some of my fellow Peruvians
Mm,
in acknowledging that these dynamics happen in the marketplace. Uh, so once the paper was published, right, I also published it on LinkedIn, on my social media, and my friends were like, "Oh, this is very interesting. I'll have a read." And some of them did read the paper. I also published an article in a newspaper outlet, and it was in Spanish, talking about my research in more kind of layman terms.
mm.
And well, luckily, nobody emailed me saying like, "What are you saying? Like, I hate you." No, no, no. So luckily, I haven't had that.
Mm,
But at the same time, people are like, do they really, like, do these chefs engage in cultural appropriation? Like, really? Because here's the thing, like, it's almost like, I call it kind of like this enchanting effect, right? That these chefs have been put on a pedestal almost,
mm.
right? That we don't want to see any negatives to it, because it's like bursting the bubble.
Yeah.
So there's kind of like this I don't know, hesitation to look at the dark side, if you will, of Peruvian cuisine, on how, some of these power dynamics are still reinforced and in different ways now. So yeah, so I think that that's one of the things. And then the second thing that also surprised me was that before, like I said, nobody was talking about cultural appropriation in the Peruvian cuisine. But lately, since the work of Maria Elena Garcia, Raúl Mata, and mine was published, I've read like a couple of interviews from two different chefs that have been saying like, I don't think I engage in cultural appropriation. We don't engage in cultural appropriation. So it's a good thing, like
Yeah,
they're
yeah.
not necessarily saying like, oh, Belinda wrote about us. No, no, no. But it's about like all these. I think they are aware that there is a group of scholars, that are looking at Peruvian cuisine from a more of a critical lens, and and they are now talking about it, which is a good thing. Which
Yeah,
is a good thing.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Cool.
So that's it.
Yeah, it's amazing. Well, thank you so much for your time and for chatting to me and answering all my questions.
Nice.
It's been really lovely to hear more, and yeah, just any discussion we have always leaves me feeling energized and with a lot of, yeah, thoughts. But
That's a pleasure. Now, same likewise.
yeah.